July 17, 1943. The Sicilian sun hung heavy in the sky, pressing heat into the dry earth like a weight that refused to lift. Dust rose in slow clouds beneath the grinding tracks of American armor, drifting across olive groves and shattered stone walls. The air carried the distant thud of artillery, low, methodical, relentless, like a heartbeat echoing across the island. Columns of vehicles stretched along narrow roads, engines growling in uneven rhythm. That sound, metal, fuel, motion, had become something more than machinery. It was a signal, a presence, the unmistakable signature of American momentum pressing forward into Europe. At the center of it all stood George S. Patton, rigid, polished, uncompromising. His helmet gleamed under the harsh light, ivory-handled pistols resting at his sides like symbols of authority rather than weapons. Around him, officers moved carefully, aware that proximity to Patton meant proximity to something volatile. Orders came fast, sharp, and absolute. There was no hesitation in his command, only motion. But beyond the dust and noise, beyond the advancing columns and collapsing axis lines, another force was shaping the battlefield. Far from the front, in carefully coordinated rooms filled with maps and measured voices, stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. Where Patton was fire, Eisenhower was structure. Where Patton saw speed as victory, Eisenhower saw balance as survival. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was not just an assault. It was a test of alliance, of coordination, of control. And control required restraint. Something Patton did not believe in. As American forces pushed deeper into Sicily, the gap between plan and execution began to widen. Roads meant to guide movement became channels of impatience. Timelines meant to synchronize armies became obstacles to momentum. The sound of engines grew louder, faster, more defiant. What had begun as a unified advance was starting to fracture, not in defeat, but in ambition. Patton was no longer simply executing a plan. He was accelerating beyond it. And in that acceleration, in that refusal to slow, the first cracks appeared between two men who represented two very different visions of victory. Because in Sicily, the enemy was not the only force being challenged. Command itself was about to be tested. The victory in North Africa had not ended the war. It had only shifted its weight. By early 1943, the Axis grip on the southern Mediterranean had begun to weaken, but it had not collapsed. German and Italian forces, though pushed back, remained organized, disciplined, and dangerous. The Allied command understood that momentum could not be lost. Every delay meant giving Adolf Hitler time to reinforce Europe's southern defenses. Every hesitation allowed the Axis to regroup. The next step had to be decisive. It was within this fragile window that the Allied leadership turned its attention towards Sicily. The island was more than just territory. It was a gateway. Positioned at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, Sicily controlled access to mainland Italy. Whoever held it could dictate naval movement, air operations, and the future of the Italian campaign. More importantly, its capture could force Italy out of the war entirely, destabilizing the Axis alliance from within. This objective became known as Operation Husky, a massive amphibious and airborne assault unlike anything attempted before on such a scale. But the complexity of the operation demanded more than firepower. It demanded coordination between nations that did not always think alike. At the center of this effort stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower's rise had been rapid, but not accidental. Unlike many battlefield commanders, his strength did not lie in dramatic offensives or personal heroics. It lay in his ability to manage egos, align competing interests, and maintain cohesion within a fragile alliance. The British and American commands operated under different doctrines, different expectations, and often different priorities. Eisenhower's role was to ensure that these differences did not fracture the war effort. His approach to Sicily reflected that mindset. The plan was precise. British forces, led by Bernard Montgomery, would land on the eastern side of the island and push north along the coast toward Messina. American forces, under George S. Patton, would land to the west, securing the flank and protecting Montgomery's advance. It was a supportive role, a necessary role, but not a leading one. For Patton, this assignment carried a weight that went beyond strategy. He had already proven himself in North Africa, transforming a struggling American force into an aggressive, effective fighting unit. Discipline, speed, and relentless pressure had become his trademarks. He believed in striking hard, moving fast, and never allowing the enemy time to recover. To him, war was not a matter of balance. It was a matter of domination. And yet, in Sicily, he was being asked to hold position, to protect, to support, to wait. The contrast between expectation and assignment created a quiet tension that ran beneath the surface of the operation. Officially, Patton accepted his role. Orders were orders. The chain of command was clear. But beneath that discipline, something else was building. Because the battlefield Patton envisioned was not one of careful coordination, it was one of relentless advance. Meanwhile, the enemy was preparing in ways the Allies could not fully predict. German forces, under experienced commanders, were already adapting to the shifting tides of war. They understood that Sicily might not be held indefinitely. Instead of committing to a rigid defense, they began preparing for a controlled withdrawal, delaying Allied forces while preserving their own strength for battles yet to come. This approach contrasted sharply with Allied expectations. The plan for Operation Husky assumed resistance, but also assumed that once broken, the enemy would collapse in disorder. What it did not fully account for was an opponent capable of retreating strategically, trading land for time, and turning the island into a prolonged campaign instead of a rapid victory. As July approached, preparations intensified. Thousands of ships gathered across the Mediterranean. Troops trained for amphibious landings under uncertain conditions. Airborne divisions prepared for night drops into unfamiliar terrain. Supplies, vehicles, weapons, all of it had to move in coordination across sea and sky under the constant threat of enemy interference. And through it all, one sound became constant. Engines, the low hum of transport ships, the roar of aircraft overhead, the grinding advance of armored divisions waiting to be unleashed. It was more than noise. It was a symbol of something larger, an industrial force unlike anything the Axis could fully match. American production, American logistics, American momentum. A machine that, once set in motion, was difficult to slow. Eisenhower understood the power of that machine, but he also understood its danger. Unchecked momentum could lead to chaos. Aggression without coordination could fracture alliances. Victory achieved without unity could create new vulnerabilities. So the plan remained unchanged. Structured, balanced, controlled, and Patton was expected to follow it. As the invasion date drew closer, the gap between design and reality remained invisible, hidden beneath maps, orders, and carefully worded briefings. On paper, everything aligned. Every movement had a purpose. Every commander had a role. But war did not unfold on paper. It unfolded in dust, confusion, fear, and instinct. And in that environment, control could slip, especially when placed in the hands of a man who believed that speed was the only truth that mattered. Because once the engines began to move, they would not all move at the same pace. The final plans for Operation Husky were not simply military instructions. They were compromises. Behind every line drawn on a map, behind every assigned sector and timed advance, there existed a quiet negotiation between competing visions of war. The Allied command was not a single unified voice. It was a coalition, held together by necessity, shaped by diplomacy as much as strategy. At the center of that delicate balance stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. His authority was absolute in structure, but constantly tested in reality. British commanders brought experience from years of war against Germany. American commanders brought fresh resources, energy, and a growing confidence. Both expected influence. Both expected results. and neither intended to be secondary for long. One of the most influential voices within this structure was Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery's approach to warfare was methodical, deliberate, and built on overwhelming preparation. He believed in concentration of force, in minimizing risk, and in ensuring that every offensive move was supported by superior strength. To him, speed without certainty was not bold, it was reckless. His influence on the Sicily Plan was significant. The eastern axis of the invasion, his axis, was designed to carry the primary offensive weight. His forces would push along the coast toward Messina, the critical exit point of the island. It was a direct path, but one that required careful build-up and sustained pressure. In contrast, George S. Patton and the American 7th Army were positioned to the west. Officially, their role was clear: secure the flank, protect the Allied landing zones, and prevent any counterattack from threatening Montgomery's advance. It was a vital responsibility, but it was not the role of a spearhead. It was not designed for glory. It was designed for stability. For Patton, this distinction was more than strategic. It was personal. He had built his identity around movement, aggression, and visible victory. In North Africa, he had restored discipline to American forces and driven them forward with relentless energy. His belief was simple: the enemy must never be given time to think, to reorganize, or to breathe. And yet, in Sicily, he was being asked to do exactly that: hold position, maintain order, and allow another commander to define the pace of the campaign. The tension between doctrine and personality began to grow. It was not expressed openly. Orders were followed. Preparations continued. But beneath the surface, Patton's impatience sharpened. Every delay in planning, every adjustment made to accommodate coalition concerns, reinforced his belief that the operation was being restrained unnecessarily. Meanwhile, the enemy's intentions were becoming clearer. German commanders on the island, experienced in both defense and withdrawal, recognized the imbalance of resources they faced. They could not match Allied numbers. They could not dominate the skies. But they could control time. Instead of preparing for a final stand, they prepared for a strategic retreat, one that would bleed the Allied advance, slow its momentum, and preserve German forces for future battles on the Italian mainland. This approach relied on discipline, coordination, and precise timing. It also relied on the Allies behaving predictably. A slow, methodical advance would give the Germans exactly what they needed: time to withdraw in order, to move equipment, and to establish new defensive lines beyond Sicily. In this sense, Montgomery's cautious approach and Eisenhower's structured plan unintentionally aligned with the enemy's strategy, and Patton could sense it. To him, the idea of allowing the enemy to escape, even as part of a broader strategic objective, was unacceptable. War, in his view, was not about managing outcomes. It was about destroying the enemy completely, leaving no room for recovery. This difference in perspective was not just tactical. It was philosophical. Eisenhower believed in winning the war. Patton believed in crushing the enemy. As the invasion began in July 1943, these differences moved from theory into reality. The landings themselves were chaotic. Strong winds disrupted airborne operations. Paratroopers were scattered across unfamiliar terrain. Naval coordination faced unexpected challenges. Yet despite these complications, Allied forces secured their beachheads and began pushing inland. And almost immediately, the contrast in command styles began to show. Montgomery's forces advanced along their planned axis, but encountered stronger resistance than expected. Narrow roads, difficult terrain, and determined German defenses slowed progress. What had been envisioned as a steady push began to stall under pressure. To the west, Patton's forces faced less resistance. The path ahead was not empty, but it was open enough to invite movement. Faster movement. The conditions that Eisenhower had planned for: balanced advances, synchronized pressure, coordinated timing, began to shift. The battlefield was no longer symmetrical. Opportunities emerged unevenly, and the commanders on the ground were forced to adapt. For Patton, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The engine of his army, those columns of tanks, trucks, and men, was no longer confined by necessity. The space ahead allowed for acceleration. The resistance did not demand caution. It invited aggression. And with that invitation came a decision: to follow the plan, or to redefine it. The sound of engines grew louder across western Sicily. Not steady, not measured, but rising. Because Patton was no longer thinking in terms of flanks and support roles. He was thinking in terms of victory. And victory, to him, was never meant to be shared slowly. It was meant to be seized, rapidly, before anyone else could claim it. Somewhere between the written orders and the unfolding battlefield, the structure of command began to loosen. Not visibly, not officially, but enough. Enough for momentum to take hold. Enough for ambition to begin reshaping strategy. Because Patton was not built to wait for history to unfold. He was built to force it forward. And in Sicily, that force was about to collide with the very system designed to control it. The tension unfolding across Sicily was not defined by a single decision or single movement. It was shaped by layers: human instinct, leadership philosophy, battlefield reality, all pressing against each other at the same time. To understand what was happening, it required looking at the conflict not as a single story, but as multiple perspectives colliding under pressure. The first angle was human. At the center of it stood George S. Patton, a man who viewed war not as a burden, but as a calling. His belief in reincarnation, his study of ancient battles, and his obsession with military history created a mindset that saw the battlefield as something almost destined. He did not simply command troops. He embodied motion itself. Every action, every order, was driven by urgency. Hesitation, in his view, was the closest thing to failure. This intensity shaped how his soldiers experienced the campaign. They moved faster. They pushed harder. They were expected to endure more. Patton demanded discipline, but he also inspired momentum. His presence at the front, his polished uniform, his visible confidence, all of it created a psychological force that drove his army forward. Yet this same intensity carried a cost. Fatigue, pressure, and fear were constant companions, often pushed aside in the name of speed. What soldiers expected, at least at the beginning, was a structured campaign, one where orders aligned with preparation. What they experienced instead was acceleration, a war that moved faster than anticipated, where rest was limited and objectives shifted as quickly as the front lines. The second angle was leadership. Opposite Patton stood Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose role was far removed from the immediacy of the battlefield. His responsibility was not just to win in Sicily, but to preserve the unity of an alliance that spanned continents. British and American forces, though fighting the same enemy, operated under different traditions. Misalignment at the top could translate into chaos below. Eisenhower's leadership style reflected this reality. He valued coordination over speed, consensus over impulse. Decisions were weighed not only for their military impact, but for their political consequences. A successful campaign that fractured Allied unity could weaken the broader war effort. For Eisenhower, restraint was not weakness, it was necessity. This created a contrast that was both subtle and profound. Where Patton saw opportunity, Eisenhower saw risk. Where Patton saw delay as failure, Eisenhower saw it as control. The third angle was tactical. The terrain of Sicily did not favor simplicity. Narrow roads, mountainous regions, and fortified towns created natural bottlenecks that slowed large-scale movement. Supply lines stretched across difficult landscapes, and communication between units was often delayed or disrupted. Within this environment, two different doctrines began to emerge. One emphasized measured advance, securing positions, maintaining supply integrity, and ensuring that each movement was supported. This approach reduced the risk of overextension but required time. The other emphasized rapid exploitation, moving quickly through weak points, bypassing resistance where possible, and maintaining constant pressure on the enemy. This approach could create breakthroughs, but also risked isolation and logistical strain. Patton's actions increasingly aligned with the second doctrine. As resistance in his sector remained lighter than expected, he began to push beyond the limits of his assigned role. Towns were captured not as endpoints, but as stepping stones. Roads became pathways for acceleration rather than boundaries for coordination. And with each advance, the sound returned. Engines, tanks rolling forward, trucks carrying supplies, columns stretching deeper into the island. It was not just movement, it was a statement, a demonstration of American industrial power, capable of sustaining a pace that few could match. That sound, constant and growing, became a symbol of something larger than the campaign itself. It represented abundance, momentum, and a belief that progress should not be restrained. Yet that same momentum began to create imbalance. Because while Patton's forces advanced rapidly, other parts of the Allied front moved at a different pace. Montgomery's progress to the east remained slower, constrained by terrain and resistance. The synchronization that had been carefully planned began to drift. The battlefield was no longer aligned, and in that misalignment, tension grew, not only between commanders, but within the structure of the operation itself. Patton's army was no longer simply supporting the plan. It was beginning to redefine it. And as that redefinition continued, the question became unavoidable. Was this momentum leading toward victory or toward fracture? The fourth angle emerged not from the Allied lines, but from the perspective of the enemy, measured, adaptive, and increasingly strategic in its restraint. German forces in Sicily, operating under experienced leadership, had already begun shifting their expectations. The goal was no longer to hold the island indefinitely. It was to control the pace of its loss. Commanders such as Albert Kesselring understood that survival, not stubborn resistance, would define long-term success. By delaying the Allied advance and preserving combat strength, German units could retreat across the Strait of Messina and continue the fight on the Italian mainland. This required discipline. Positions were held just long enough to inflict resistance, then abandoned before encirclement. Roads were mined, bridges destroyed, and defensive pockets established to create the illusion of strength while masking withdrawal. It was not a collapse, it was a controlled exit. And in this strategy, time became the most valuable weapon. Every hour the Allies spent reorganizing, every day lost to coordination, was a day gained for evacuation. From this perspective, the differences within Allied command became an advantage. A slower, synchronized advance gave the Germans exactly what they needed. But an unpredictable, accelerating force, one that moved faster than anticipated, threatened to disrupt that carefully managed retreat. In the West, that force had a name. The fifth angle was moral, less visible, but no less significant. War placed enormous strain on the human mind. Fatigue, fear, and constant exposure to violence created conditions where discipline could fracture. Within Patton's command, the demand for relentless movement intensified that strain. Soldiers were pushed forward with little pause, expected to maintain composure under pressure that few could fully withstand. It was in this environment that one of the most controversial moments of the campaign occurred. During inspections of field hospitals, George S. Patton encountered soldiers suffering not from visible wounds, but from what was then understood as battle fatigue. Conditions like what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder were poorly understood, often dismissed as weakness rather than injury. Patton's reaction was immediate and severe. He viewed psychological collapse as a failure of discipline, a threat to the fighting spirit he demanded from his army. In two separate incidents, he struck soldiers who were unable to return to combat, ordering them back to the front. These actions did not remain isolated. Reports moved upward through the chain of command, reaching Dwight D. Eisenhower. The response was measured but firm. Eisenhower recognized both the effectiveness of Patton's leadership and the danger of his behavior. Maintaining discipline was essential, but so was maintaining moral authority. The incident revealed a deeper divide. For Patton, war was a test of strength, physical, mental, absolute. For Eisenhower, war required strength, but also understanding, restraint, and responsibility toward those who fought it. This was no longer just a difference in tactics. It was a difference in values. The sixth angle was psychological, less about the enemy, and more about the invisible pressures within Allied command itself. Success creates expectation. As Patton's forces continued to advance rapidly across western Sicily, comparisons became inevitable. Progress was measured not just in miles, but in perception. Reports of swift American gains contrasted with slower movement elsewhere. Though each front faced different conditions, the narrative of speed versus delay began to take shape. And with it came competition. Not officially, not openly, but undeniably. For commanders like Bernard Montgomery, whose operations were designed for methodical success, the idea of being overtaken, symbolically or literally, introduced pressure. For Patton, the opportunity to demonstrate superiority, to prove the effectiveness of his aggressive doctrine, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Eisenhower stood between these forces. He was no longer simply coordinating an invasion. He was managing ambition, perception, and the fragile balance of alliance politics. Every decision carried weight beyond the battlefield. Favoring one approach risked alienating another. Allowing competition to grow risked undermining unity. Yet the battlefield did not pause for deliberation. Patton's advance continued. Faster, deeper. The sound of engines, those constant, driving engines, echoed across Sicily, no longer just a symbol of movement, but of divergence. They carried not only soldiers and supplies, but intention, a belief that war could be won through speed alone. But as those engines moved forward, they also moved further from the plan that had set them in motion. The battlefield, once defined by Allied unity, was beginning to reflect something more complex. Not division, not yet, but something close enough to create tension. Because in war, it is not only the enemy that shapes the outcome, it is the balance between those who fight it. And in Sicily, that balance was beginning to shift, quietly, steadily, and with increasing consequence. By late July 1943, the campaign in Sicily had entered a phase where momentum began to outweigh planning. The original structure of Operation Husky was still in place on paper, two coordinated advances converging toward Messina, but the reality on the ground had drifted from its design. The battlefield was no longer symmetrical. Opportunities appeared unevenly, and one commander, more than any other, was prepared to act on them without hesitation. George S. Patton had reached a point where restraint no longer aligned with his understanding of war. His forces, advancing through western Sicily, encountered resistance, but not the kind that demanded caution. Town after town fell under pressure, sometimes after brief engagements, sometimes after the enemy had already begun to withdraw. The pattern became clear. The Germans were not holding their ground. They were trading it. To Patton, this was not a signal to slow down. It was an invitation to accelerate. Orders that had once defined his role began to lose their rigidity. Securing the flank was no longer enough. Holding position became secondary to pushing forward. The logic was simple, direct, and in his mind, undeniable. If the enemy was retreating, then the only acceptable response was pursuit, relentless, immediate, and unbroken. And so the direction of the American 7th Army began to shift. Instead of remaining confined to the western sector, Patton turned his attention northward, toward Palermo. The decision carried both strategic and symbolic weight. Palermo was not just a city. It was the capital of Sicily, a major port, and a political center whose fall would signal the collapse of Axis control over the island. Capturing it would not only disrupt enemy logistics but also demonstrate the reach and effectiveness of American forces. But it was not part of the original plan. Advancing toward Palermo required stretching supply lines, redirecting units, and operating beyond the carefully balanced coordination established by Dwight D. Eisenhower. It introduced risk, exactly the kind Eisenhower had worked to minimize. Yet on the ground, the calculation felt different. Patton saw speed as protection. The faster his forces moved, the less time the enemy had to organize resistance. The deeper they pushed, the harder it became for German units to maintain cohesion. Momentum, in his view, was not just an advantage, it was a shield. The engines moved. Columns of tanks rolled through narrow Sicilian roads, kicking up dust that lingered in the heat. Trucks followed in long lines, carrying fuel, ammunition, and men who had learned to measure time not in hours, but in distance covered. The sound was constant, metal, motion, and intent, echoing through valleys and across open terrain. That sound became a force of its own. Villagers heard it before they saw it. German units, already preparing to withdraw, found themselves pressured to move faster than planned. Every mile gained compressed the space in which the enemy could operate. On July 22, 1943, Palermo fell. The capture was swift compared to the scale of the campaign. Italian resistance in the city was limited, and German forces had already begun pulling back. Yet the significance of the moment extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a statement. Patton had not only advanced beyond his assigned role, he had done so successfully. The victory altered perception. Within Allied command, it became impossible to ignore the results of Patton's approach. While other sectors faced delays and resistance, his forces had achieved a major objective through speed and initiative. The question that followed was not simple. Was this a demonstration of effective leadership, or a dangerous deviation from coordinated strategy? For Eisenhower, the answer was complex. He could not deny the success. Palermo was valuable, both strategically and symbolically. But success achieved outside the boundaries of the plan introduced uncertainty. If one commander acted independently, what prevented others from doing the same? If coordination broke down, the entire structure of Allied operations could weaken. And yet, the campaign was still unfolding. Beyond Palermo lay the final objective, Messina. The northeastern tip of Sicily, the narrow passage separating the island from mainland Italy. It was the escape route the Germans were already preparing to use. Every delay allowed them to move troops, equipment, and supplies across the strait, preserving their strength for future battles. For Patton, the path forward became clear. The campaign was no longer about securing territory. It was about reaching Messina first, not just to capture a city, but to cut off the enemy before they could escape. At the same time, to the east, Bernard Montgomery continued his advance under far more difficult conditions. Stronger resistance, challenging terrain, and fortified positions slowed progress along the coastal route. What had been intended as the primary axis of attack became a grinding push against a disciplined defense. The imbalance grew more visible. Patton was moving faster. Montgomery was facing heavier resistance. And between them, the distance to Messina was shrinking. The campaign, once structured around cooperation, began to take on the shape of something else. A race, not declared, not acknowledged in official terms, but felt in decisions, in movement, in urgency. Because reaching Messina first was no longer just about strategy. It was about proving a point. That speed could outmatch structure, that aggression could outpace caution, and that victory, once within reach, should not be shared, it should be seized. The engines roared louder as the American advance turned eastward, cutting across the island with increasing determination. Behind them lay Palermo. Ahead of them lay Messina. And between those 2 points, the final test of Patton's defiance was beginning to take shape, one that would not only challenge the enemy, but the very foundation of Allied command. The road to Messina narrowed as the campaign entered its final phase. By early August 1943, the island of Sicily had become less a battlefield of conquest and more a corridor of escape. German forces, under the careful direction of Albert Kesselring, executed a withdrawal that was as disciplined as it was deliberate. Bridges were destroyed behind retreating units. Rearguards delayed Allied advances just long enough to maintain order. Ferries and transport vessels moved constantly across the narrow Strait of Messina, carrying men and machinery toward mainland Italy. It was not a rout. It was a calculated evacuation. For the Allies, this created a shrinking window, one defined not by territory, but by time. At the center of that race stood George S. Patton. After the fall of Palermo, his focus had shifted entirely eastward. The objective was no longer implicit. It was singular. Reach Messina. Cut off the German escape. End the campaign not just with victory, but with destruction of the enemy's remaining strength. To achieve this, Patton drove his forces along multiple axes, pushing them through the northern coastal roads and inland routes simultaneously. Amphibious end runs were launched behind enemy positions, landing troops along the coastline to outflank German defenses. These operations, risky and complex, reflected his willingness to improvise beyond conventional planning. The engines never stopped. Tanks advanced along narrow roads carved between mountains and sea. Trucks carried reinforcements and supplies over distances that stretched logistical limits. Naval vessels maneuvered along the coast, supporting landings that kept pressure on retreating forces. The sound of movement, constant, mechanical, unyielding, followed the American advance like an echo of inevitability. And yet, even as Patton accelerated, the reality of the situation became increasingly clear. The Germans were not collapsing. They were leaving. Each delay, whether caused by terrain, resistance, or coordination, allowed more units to slip across the strait. Equipment, artillery, and thousands of soldiers were evacuated in an operation that demonstrated a level of efficiency the Allies had not fully anticipated. To the east, Bernard Montgomery continued his advance under pressure. His forces encountered some of the strongest German defensive efforts of the campaign. Narrow coastal routes and fortified positions slowed progress, forcing methodical assaults that consumed time and resources. The contrast between the two advances intensified the sense of urgency. Patton's forces were moving fast, but not fast enough to completely close the gap. The race was not just between Allied commanders. It was between pursuit and escape. Within Allied command, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a situation that balanced success against consequence. The campaign was undeniably moving toward victory. Sicily would fall. The strategic objective, opening the path to mainland Italy, was being achieved. But the manner of that achievement raised difficult questions. Patton's actions had delivered results. Palermo, rapid advances, constant pressure. Yet they had also stretched the framework of coordination that held the Allied effort together. Montgomery's slower progress was not failure. It was the result of a different set of conditions and a different doctrine. Managing these differences, while maintaining unity, became as critical as defeating the enemy. By mid-August, the final approach to Messina began. German rear guards fought delaying actions with precision, buying the last hours needed for evacuation. Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, compressing the remaining space. Artillery echoed across the narrowing front. Aircraft patrolled the skies, targeting movement wherever possible. But the flow across the strait did not stop. Night after night, under cover of darkness, German units continued to withdraw. Ferries moved in silence, protected by anti-aircraft fire and careful coordination. What remained on the island was no longer the full strength of an army, but its final shield. On August 17, 1943, the campaign reached its conclusion. George S. Patton entered Messina. Hours later, Bernard Montgomery arrived as well. The city, largely abandoned by German forces, marked the end of organized resistance in Sicily. The objective had been achieved. The island was under Allied control. But the moment carried a dual meaning. Patton had reached Messina first, a symbolic victory, one that reinforced his belief in speed, aggression, and decisive action. The race, though unofficial, had been won. His forces had crossed the island, captured key objectives, and arrived at the final destination ahead of schedule. Yet the deeper objective remained incomplete. More than 100,000 German and Axis troops had successfully evacuated to mainland Italy, along with thousands of vehicles and significant amounts of equipment. The destruction Patton had sought, the complete collapse of enemy forces, had not occurred. Victory, in this sense, was partial. For Eisenhower, it was a strategic success. Sicily had been secured. The next phase of the war, Italy, could begin. The alliance had held together through a complex operation. For Patton, it was something else. A success that felt unfinished. Because the enemy had escaped. The engines, which had driven his advance across the island, had carried him to the final objective, but not in time to close the final door. And in that gap between arrival and outcome, the true impact of the campaign began to emerge. Not just in territory gained, but in the questions left behind. Questions about speed and control, about independence and coordination, about whether victory achieved outside the plan strengthened the war effort or quietly strained it. Because in Messina, the battlefield fell silent. But the consequences of how it had been fought were only beginning to be understood. Messina fell into silence on August 17, 1943, but the silence did not mean resolution. It marked a transition, from battlefield movement to political consequence, from operational urgency to institutional judgment. The dust of Sicily had barely settled when reports began reaching higher command channels. Among them, the most sensitive centered not on victory itself, but on conduct during victory. At the center of those reports stood George S. Patton. His rapid advance across Sicily had achieved what many considered remarkable operational success. Palermo had fallen quickly. German positions had been pressured across multiple axes. The final arrival at Messina placed American forces at the symbolic end of the campaign's objective. Yet within Allied headquarters, the discussion was not only about speed, it was about control. Because success in war was never measured in isolation. It was measured within structure, and that structure was commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had spent the Sicily campaign balancing competing doctrines of warfare. On one side, the methodical and coordinated approach represented by British forces under Bernard Montgomery. On the other, the aggressive and rapidly advancing style embodied by Patton. Both approaches produced results, but only one could define the operational standard without risking fragmentation of command unity. The situation reached its most critical point not on the battlefield, but in hospital tents. Earlier in the campaign, incidents had been reported in which Patton physically struck soldiers suffering from combat stress. These actions, later widely documented and reviewed, were interpreted by medical personnel and command observers as violations of acceptable conduct, even by the harsh standards of war. The issue escalated beyond internal discipline. It became a political liability. When the reports reached Eisenhower, the response was not immediate public action, but private assessment. He understood Patton's value. He also understood the danger of allowing unchecked behavior to undermine Allied cohesion, especially at a moment when the invasion of mainland Italy was being prepared. The result was a carefully measured decision. Patton was relieved of operational command in the immediate aftermath of the Sicily campaign. Not dismissed, not erased, but removed from direct leadership. This decision reflected a deeper truth about Allied warfare. Effectiveness alone was not enough. Command required not only results, but reliability within a shared system. No single commander, regardless of success, could operate outside the framework that held the alliance together. While Patton's reputation absorbed the consequences of the controversy, the broader campaign analysis revealed a more complex picture. Militarily, the Sicily operation was a success. The island had been secured. Axis forces had been expelled. The path into mainland Europe was open. Strategically, the Allied position had strengthened significantly, but operationally, the outcome was incomplete. The German evacuation, executed under the disciplined withdrawal strategy of Albert Kesselring, had preserved a significant portion of Axis manpower. Thousands of experienced soldiers, along with equipment and artillery, were transferred to the Italian mainland. This meant that while Sicily was lost, the German military machine in Europe remained intact and ready for continued resistance. This dual reality shaped Allied planning going forward. Success had been achieved, but not total destruction. And in modern warfare, that distinction mattered. Inside military assessments, Patton's rapid advance was analyzed with caution. His ability to exploit weak points, maintain momentum, and capture key objectives demonstrated clear tactical brilliance. However, his tendency to extend beyond assigned parameters raised concerns about predictability and coordination. Eisenhower's leadership, meanwhile, was evaluated through a different lens. His success lay not in speed or battlefield dominance, but in preservation of alliance unity. He had managed competing commanders, national interests, and operational doctrines without allowing the structure to collapse. In coalition warfare, that stability was itself a form of victory. Yet the personal consequences for Patton were immediate. He was reassigned away from frontline command in the European theater's immediate next phase. Public attention intensified around his actions, and internal discussions questioned how and when he might be reintegrated into future operations. But removal from command did not erase his influence. If anything, it redirected it, because the Allied High Command was already preparing for the next and far more critical stage, the invasion of mainland Italy. And even in absence, Patton's aggressive doctrine continued to shape debates about how future operations should balance speed, coordination, and risk. Across Europe, the war was expanding, and Sicily had become a reference point. A case study, a moment where success and controversy existed side by side. The engines that had carried Patton across the island were no longer moving forward. But their impact had not stopped. It had simply shifted from battlefield momentum to strategic memory. After the dust of Sicily settled, the war did not pause to reflect. It simply moved forward, relentlessly, as it always had, but now carrying the lessons, tensions, and unresolved judgments left behind by the campaign. The departure of German forces across the Strait of Messina under the direction of Albert Kesselring became one of the most studied outcomes of the operation. Militarily, it represented a successful withdrawal under pressure. Strategically, it preserved combat power that would soon reappear in the defense of mainland Italy. For Allied intelligence, it was a warning. Victory on an island did not guarantee destruction of an army. Within Allied planning circles, the implications were immediate. The next phase of the war in Europe, operations on the Italian mainland, would face an enemy already reinforced by experience gained in Sicily. Defensive lines would be stronger. Withdrawal tactics would be more refined. The Germans had learned not just how to resist Allied power, but how to survive it. And that survival was enabled, in part, by time. Time that had slipped away during the final stages of the Sicilian campaign. At the center of the post-operation analysis remained the contrasting leadership styles that had defined the battle. Dwight D. Eisenhower was now tasked with shaping the next phase of Allied strategy. His focus shifted from managing Sicily to preparing for a far more complex undertaking, the invasion of Western Europe. Every decision moving forward had to account not only for military effectiveness, but for coalition stability. The success of Sicily proved that the alliance could function, but also revealed how fragile that function could become under pressure. Eisenhower's handling of the situation involving George S. Patton became part of that larger strategic balancing act. Patton's removal from frontline command in the immediate aftermath was not a permanent exile, but a controlled pause. Officially, it was framed as part of organizational rotation and discipline. Unofficially, it was a signal, Even the most successful commanders operated within boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence. The controversy surrounding Patton's conduct, particularly the incidents involving soldiers suffering from combat stress, now recognized in modern terms as psychological trauma, continued to circulate through military and political channels. While some viewed his actions as unacceptable, others saw them as reflections of a harsher wartime reality where discipline and endurance were often prioritized over individual vulnerability. This division of interpretation ensured that Patton's reputation remained complex rather than resolved. He was neither fully condemned nor fully exonerated. Instead, he became something more strategically useful and politically sensitive at the same time. A commander whose effectiveness was undeniable, but whose unpredictability required careful management. Meanwhile, on the ground, Allied soldiers who had fought through Sicily carried their own understanding of the campaign. For many, the experience was defined less by strategic outcomes and more by the physical and psychological strain of constant movement. The rapid advances under Patton's command had pushed units to their limits, creating a pace of warfare that left little room for recovery. Yet those same soldiers also witnessed something unprecedented. They saw the power of sustained mobility. They saw how quickly territory could collapse when pressure was maintained. They saw the mechanical rhythm of modern warfare, tracked vehicles, coordinated supply chains, and air support, working together to create a continuous forward motion that the Axis forces struggled to match. That rhythm became a defining feature of Allied warfare moving forward. The symbolic weight of that rhythm was often described in simple terms: engines. Engines of tanks pushing through narrow roads. Engines of trucks sustaining supply lines across rugged terrain. Engines of aircraft overhead maintaining pressure from the sky. Together, they formed a representation of industrial war at full scale, an expression of material capacity turned into motion. In Sicily, that motion had proven decisive, even if not perfectly controlled. In the broader historical interpretation of the campaign, this became one of its central lessons. Speed could create opportunity, but coordination determined outcome. The tension between those two principles would continue to define Allied operations for the remainder of the war. As 1943 progressed, attention shifted toward the Italian mainland. Plans for new amphibious landings, new supply challenges, and new coordination problems began to take shape. The lessons of Sicily, both its successes and its limitations, were embedded into these preparations. And quietly, beneath official reports and strategic reviews, one question lingered within military leadership circles. What role would commanders like Patton play in the future of the war? Commanders who could generate momentum. Commanders who could break stagnation. But also commanders whose independence could disrupt carefully balanced coalitions. The answer was not immediate, but it would come soon enough. Because in war, no capability remains unused for long, and no lesson remains untested. Sicily had ended, but its consequences were still unfolding, reshaping not just plans on a map, but the very philosophy of how the Allied war machine would move forward into Europe. After Sicily, the war entered a quieter phase on the surface, but beneath that silence, its foundations had already shifted. The island had been taken. Axis forces had been expelled. The Mediterranean corridor had been opened further for Allied movement. In official reports, Operation Husky was recorded as a success, an essential stepping stone toward the invasion of mainland Italy. But history rarely settles on official reports alone, because what Sicily truly revealed was not just the weakness of the Axis in that region, but the complexity of Allied power itself. At the center of that complexity stood two contrasting forces. On one side, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a commander who understood that victory in a coalition war was not only about defeating the enemy, but about holding together nations, personalities, and strategies that did not naturally align. His strength was structure. His battlefield was coordination. His victories were often invisible, measured not in territory taken, but in unity preserved. On the other side stood George S. Patton, a commander driven by momentum, belief in decisive action, and an almost instinctive trust in speed as the ultimate weapon. For him, war was not meant to be carefully balanced. It was meant to be broken open, forced forward, and resolved through relentless pressure. Between these two philosophies lay the central lesson of Sicily. Speed without structure creates instability. Structure without speed risks delay. Neither alone was sufficient. What made the Sicilian campaign historically significant was not just its outcome, but the tension it exposed between these two truths. The advance across the island was powered by industrial strength, symbolized by the constant roar of engines, tanks, trucks, landing craft, and aircraft working together to project force across terrain that had once seemed difficult to penetrate. That sound became more than military noise. It became a symbol of American industrial capacity transformed into movement, a symbol of modern warfare where logistics mattered as much as courage, a symbol of how abundance, fuel, machinery, manpower could be converted into strategic momentum. But even that symbol carried a warning, because abundance alone does not guarantee control. The same engines that drove rapid advances also stretched supply lines. The same speed that captured territory also allowed enemy forces, under disciplined withdrawal strategies led by commanders such as Albert Kesselring, to escape when pressure was not perfectly synchronized. Victory, in Sicily, was therefore complete, but not absolute. And that distinction mattered. For the soldiers who fought there, the experience left a lasting imprint. They had seen how quickly war could move when conditions allowed it. They had also seen how easily opportunity could slip away when coordination failed to align perfectly with momentum. For commanders, the lesson was even more profound. The future of the war would not be decided by a single style of leadership. It would be decided by the ability to merge opposing instincts, aggression with control, speed with planning, independence with unity. In the months that followed, as Allied forces prepared for deeper operations in Italy and beyond, Sicily remained present in every discussion, not as a memory of victory alone, but as a case study in balance. And somewhere within that evolving strategy, even the controversial figure of Patton remained part of the calculation. His methods could not be ignored. His results could not be dismissed. Yet his independence required careful integration into a system that depended on coordination at a continental scale. The war would eventually move on to larger battles, greater landings, and more decisive confrontations. But Sicily stayed behind as something foundational, a turning point not defined by a single explosion or final shot, but by the interaction of systems, human, mechanical, and strategic, colliding under the pressure of war. And in that collision, one truth became clear. Modern victory was no longer the product of one man's brilliance alone. It was the outcome of balance, between speed and structure, between ambition and control, between the roar of engines and the silence of coordination. Sicily ended as a victory, but it began a deeper question that would follow the Allies all the way to the end of the war. Not just how to win battles, but how to make victory complete.